Alright, it's official now. I'm a pre-release creator. Hello, and welcome to my second video about these stellar buffs before they're released. I want to thank you guys so much for showing your support on the last video, and I've been getting a lot of questions on that video about how these stellar buffs are going to affect these characters' build paths. And as I've looked into it, I've found a lot of interesting stuff to talk about. First, I'm going to go over some stuff that I missed from the last video or things that have changed, which this is a good time to have a reminder. This is still beta. We're much closer to the release of these characters, so it's less likely that significant changes will be made, but it's still possible. And then second, we're going to go over each of these characters and how these new buffs affect their build paths. Let's just start off talking about some of the specifics of the Stellar Conduct reaction itself. First things first, they actually did change it back from counting applications to counting elemental hits, so good thing I went over both of the methods in that video. But yeah, now instead of gaining stacks from applications, you gain stacks from doing multiple elemental hits of either one of the elements involved. As for exactly what those stacks do, I have to correct something that I said in that video. Originally, I said that each one of these stacks that you gain will give you damage bonus towards electro damage, cryo damage, and stellar conduct damage, but that's not fully correct. You get damage bonus for cryo and electro damage, but stellar conduct doesn't gain damage bonus, it gains a base multiplier. Base multipliers can be found in passives like this. Upon meeting these conditions, charged attack Equitable Judgment deals 110%, 125%, or 160% of its original damage. These aren't traditional sources of damage percent, they are multipliers on the base scaling of the original attack that they're talking about. This is a much more impactful stat than damage bonus, given as it is an entirely separate multiplier being thrown into the equation. A 50% increase on the base damage of stellar conduct damage is an actual 50% increase in your stellar conduct damage. That's big. So getting a characters that do a lot of elemental hits and can stack up this counter as much as possible is very important to stellar conduct teams. On the flip side, regular cryo and electro damage are affected a lot less by stacks. I believe the current numbers, just by triggering the reaction itself one time without having to build any stacks, the entire party is given 28% cryo and electro damage bonus. That's not a small amount of stats. Over the past 2 years, we have had two very impactful artifact sets that give 40% damage bonus, only 12% more than the base amount of damage bonus that you get from triggering Stellar Conduct. Granted, traditional Stellar Conduct teams aren't going to be dealing that much cryo and electro damage, but you can certainly get some good mileage by slotting in a unit like Fischl, who might be able to get some of her own offensive utility by using a set like Tenacity, while also getting some good extra damage out of that damage bonus buff. In any case, the base effect that you get from triggering the reaction is 28% damage bonus, and the value that you get from each additional stack is only 1%. You can get up to 12 stacks, maxing out at 40% damage bonus, which then matches the damage bonus given by these two crazy new sets. But most of the value of the damage bonus given to cryo and electro damage is front-loaded and is contained in just triggering the reaction. So for teams doing less stellar conduct and more regular cryo and electro damage, they have a much smaller focus on doing a lot of elemental hits and building up those stacks. That's everything that I have to talk about with the base reaction. Let's just cover one final thing that I went over in my original video. Cyno's kit was still a little bit up in the air when I was recording that video, but since putting it out, we did get a special program and we did see an example of Cyno getting his infusion by using his skill. He on-fields a little bit, he even uses an enhanced skill, but afterwards he immediately exits his burst state, which confirms the wording in his skill that says, when Cyno is under the Paxthorn Path Clearer state triggered by Sacred Rite Wolf Swiftness, he will instead do a Mortuary Rite and extend the duration of Paxthorn Path Clearer, which means he can get his infusion and use an enhanced skill just by using his skill. He doesn't need his burst to do that, but the version of his infusion that he gets through his skill will not be able to be extended by using more skills. If he gets his infusion through his skill instead of his burst, he can only do do one enhanced skill, and he on-fields for a very short amount of time. Now, one final thing about Stellar Conduct before we get into the video. I had a lot of people in my comments saying that Cryo Traveler is confirmed to enable stellar reactions, and that is just not true. We do have two separate instances of footage where Cryo Traveler triggers a Stellar Conduct, but we can't see a team in either of those pieces of footage. So yes, Cryo Traveler triggered a Stellar Conduct, but we don't know if he was the one enabling it. It could have been Snezhnaya or some other unseen character enabling the triggering of the reaction. The promotional footage does suggest that Cryo Traveler will be able to activate these reactions, but I'm not going to take that for granted until we get more solid proof. Now, let's talk about build paths. And we can pretty much stay on Cyno here, because him, Wriothesley, and Yaimiko don't have all that much to talk about. They all pretty much just use the new Superconduct set now. The two-piece gives attack percent, it gives 16% crit rate if you attack an opponent affected by Superconduct, and the current part that's obscured, talking about Snezhnaya, is going to be a 40% Stellar Conduct damage bonus. They like attack percent, they like crit rate, they like Stellar Conduct damage bonus. Not all that much to say about it. And yes, I have tested the set. The 16% crit rate effect does work off field, so Yai can still get perfectly good use out of it. The only interesting to talk about with any of them is what main stats they'll be using now, and don't look at my main stats. I haven't farmed this set nearly enough, but it's pretty simple. All of them are going to be using crit circlets, whichever balances your ratio better, and for your sands and your goblet, they kind of all exist on a spectrum. Wriothesley doesn't have any sort of things in his main kit that incentivize him to build EM, and given that Stellar Conduct doesn't scale off of damage bonus, his main stats of choice are going to be an attack percent timepiece and an attack percent goblet. EM isn't a completely worthless stat on him, it's a good substat, but given that EM has diminishing returns in how much reaction damage bonus it gives you, you're better off relying on the small amount of damage bonus that is going to be given by his buffed kit, and whatever EM buffs that we might end up getting in Snezhnaya. Even if we don't end up getting an EM buffing set, we still have Instructor, and that's going to be a decent option for supports on Wriothesley teams. Going down the line, Yaimiko is mainly an attack scaling character, but she does have some minor incentives in her base kit to be building EM. EM gives her damage bonus on her skill, and combined with the fact that it will also give her Stellar Conduct damage bonus, EM is a much more useful stat on her. It's still not good enough to go a full EM build on her, and her layout of choice will be one attack percent main stat and one EM main stat. Given that both your timepiece and your goblet can both have EM or attack percent as their main stat, it doesn't matter which is which, you should select them based on substats. If your attack sands have better substats and your EM goblets have better substats, then go attack sands EM goblet, and of course vice versa. Whichever one fits your build better. Now all the way down the line is Cyno, who actually has some significant scalings coming from EM. Both his normal attacks and his Duststalker bolts gain a little bit of additional scaling based on his EM, and of course he's going to benefit from the fact that EM gives reaction damage bonus, and he's going to be doing Stellar Conduct reaction damage. Granted, the EM scaling that he gets on his Stellar Conduct damage are considered quills and therefore are not affected by Stellar Conduct damage bonus. So even though EM is optimal on him, attack percent isn't horribly far behind. Of course, his signature in Staff of Scarlet Sands converts EM into attack percent, so that makes EM pull ahead a lot more. But if you don't have his signature, you do have a little bit more freedom with his builds, and should build him based on whichever has the best substats. If you have way better attack percent pieces than EM, then you can go attack percent until you get some better EM pieces. All in all, these three have pretty simple build paths, and of course, if you're not running them in their new Stellar Conduct teams, their builds don't change at all. And I'm recording this later on, but before we moved on, I wanted to mention one last thing. Let's talk about Thundering Fury. Seeing as it grants a Lunar Charge damage bonus now that Lunar Charge is in the game, it's reasonable to assume that it will also provide a Stellar Conduct damage bonus when that gets added. Although Cyno is actually not the unit that is going to be an interesting option on. All of his stellar damage is going to be coming out of his special skills, where his Duststalker bolts get converted into Stellar Conduct damage, and he only gets his special skills at set intervals, so Thundering Fury giving you more regular skills in between the special ones really doesn't impact your damage all that much. The actual interesting unit to talk about is Yai, because she now has a new effect where if she casts her skill when 3 turrets are already out, not only does she replace the turret, but she deals a little bit of AoE damage as she does it. In Stellar Conduct teams, that damage becomes Stellar Conduct. The multiplier isn't great, but it's also not terrible. Yai's new ability to convert extra skill casts into direct damage actually gives her a tiny bit of synergy with Thundering Fury. It's not going to be a great option by any means, but there is some potential to do weird on-field quick swap stuff with Yai, where she spams reactions and lowers her own skill cooldown to deal some extra stellar damage. Their weapon options are similarly uninteresting. Both Wriothesley and Yaimiko's signature weapons have been updated to work better with Stellar Conduct, giving Stellar Conduct damage bonus instead of just regular damage bonus, which would be asynergistic with this new playstyle. But even outside that, most of their weapon options still stay the same. Widsith is as good of an option as ever. It still gives 2 beneficial stats to both Yaimiko and Wriothesley. They both care a lot less about elemental damage bonus now, so that is a bit more of a dead stat on both of them, but in turn, they both care a lot more about elemental mastery. An elemental damage bonus isn't completely useless on them, so if anything, these buffs have only made Widsith a better option by making the absolute minimum value it can give better. If you somehow don't have Widsith, Flowing Purity is still a functional option, but the fact that it gives damage bonus in its passive makes it a lot worse than it used to be, and you shouldn't have any trouble meeting its healing passives. Wriothesley is still able to heal himself and proc its effect just fine, and of course we have 2 healers that have been made into Stellar Conduct supports in Diona and Qiqi. Running either one of them with Yaimiko is going to make her able to meet that passive, although, like I mentioned, because it gives damage bonus, it's a lot less necessary to meet that passive in general. Ideally, they will be getting a few better craftable weapon options in Snezhnaya, but that remains to be seen. But in general, on both of them, Widsith is still cracked, and if you have a Widsith, you should probably be using it. Cyno's signature didn't change at all because it already gave him effects that were useful in Stellar Conduct. It converts EM to attack, both good stats for him, and most of his already good weapon options did a similar thing. Missive Wind Spear is an effective older event weapon. If you pick up the Battle Pass, Ballad of the Fjords is a fine option, although it is worth noting that its passive requires you to have 3 different elemental types in your party, and that might be hard to achieve with the new design of Stellar Conduct. A lot of its best units are Cryo and Electro, and you don't end up running a 3rd element, but you still have options like Sucrose that are decent in the slot that can activate this weapon. Notably, White Tassel is a much worse option on him now. It's still functional given it gives a good amount of crit rate in its substat, but the passive is a lot less useful than it used to be. Most of his damage is concentrated in his skills and not his normal attacks, so even a weapon like Blackcliff is going to be better for the higher stat value it gives. Now, let's talk about the more interesting characters, and I'm actually going to save you until last, because I recently got her to level 90, and I have been having a lot of fun thinking about these new Mizuki buffs, and she has some pretty interesting numerical stuff going on. So let's just talk about our other 3 supportive units first. Just like the 3 limited characters, these 3 supports all have pretty similar build paths to each other, but they have a little bit of a wider variety in sets. Their main 3 set options at current are Noblesse, Instructor, and Tenacity. Granted, we will likely be getting a Snezhnaya supportive set, and once that happens, depending on what its restrictions are, they might end up running that instead. Even their main pieces and their substats are surprisingly similar. They all have static buffs that aren't based on any sort of stat that you need to build, so as long as you are able to activate their buffing abilities, you can kind of do whatever you want for substats after that. Given that all of them can have significant personal damage, I imagine that's going to be a path that a lot of people end up taking. Beidou has her 2 skills, which don't have negligible scaling, and she uses her burst to buff, and while she does need multi-target scenarios to get really good damage, these scalings aren't nothing on their own. Getting 200% attack scaling electro damage up to once every second isn't completely negligible, and like I mentioned, Beidou doesn't need to build any specific stat to activate any buffs in her kit. Her buffs are all static and contained within her C6. So given that her energy needs are so heavily reduced by these Stellar Conduct changes, she's able to build a lot more crit, a lot more attack percent, and Noblesse is also a functional damaging set on her, her, it has a useful 2-piece, she can snapshot the 4-piece. So after you meet her energy needs, you're kinda just able to build crit and make her deal a little bit of damage from there. Diona is in a very similar position to Beidou. Granted, once she gets her Stellar Conduct buffs, she's not going to be reliant on her burst to deal damage. Most of the damage in her kit is going to come from using her skill with her new passive. But just like Beidou, she does have significant buffs contained within her C6. We can see one of them now, 200 Elemental Mastery. So she still is going to need to build energy recharge if you want to get significant value out of her on your teams. I did mention in my last video that she does struggle to use Tenacity of the Middle Lip effectively. Tenacity only has a 3-second duration, and her effect that deals skill damage can only be triggered every 3.5 seconds, and even then, it has a trigger condition to do a reaction, so you aren't going to be triggering that condition exactly every 3.5 seconds. Tenacity does have some significant downtime on Diona, but if the only other supportive unit in your team is someone like Beidou, who can't get any use out of Tenacity because she can't hit with her skill off field, you're obviously going to want to have Beidou on Noblesse and Diona on Tenacity. Even if it isn't perfectly synergistic and she doesn't get great uptime on it, the fact that she can use it at all will make it worth putting on her. Of course, here I have Instructors. While Instructors is a good damaging set for these new teams, it has issues of its own. Only 8 seconds of uptime and the need to trigger a reaction to get its effect. It's very possible that you're going to run into issues doing that. You'll have to specifically use an Electro unit right before going into Diona so you can guarantee an Electro Aura and actually trigger a reaction using the set. But if you can find a build and a rotation that works well with Instructors, it's a perfectly usable set. I'd say usually you're probably going to end up using Noblesse on Diona, but you might end up in a situation where you already have another unit on Noblesse, and in that case, Tenacity is a fine set that has some downsides, and Instructors is a fine set that has some downsides. And of course, just like Beidou, Diona doesn't have any sort of buffs that she needs to build for. As long as she gets her burst off, all of her buffs will be active on your on-field party member. And while I'm on this final note, I'm going to do one last honorable mention, or maybe a dishonorable mention, in Golden Troop. This is not a good option. This is mostly a funny option. Most of Diona's damage is going to be skill damage, and she's going to be off-field while she deals it, and that is what Golden Troop as a set is built to do. So if you're gonna go all in on DPS Diona, Golden Troop is the way to go. Just be warned that DPS Diona is not the way to go. The things that were true about Diona and Beidou are mostly the case with Qiqi as well, but she does have some minor differences. The first difference is that Qiqi doesn't have any sort of significant buffing in her burst. With both Diona and Beidou, that is where a significant amount of their buffing is coming from, so you have to build energy recharge if you want them to be functional units. That is not the case with Qiqi. Her burst only deals damage, and its damage is not particularly great. It's there and you can get a big funny number out of it, but it's not worth totally speccing into. Granted, just like Beidou and Diona, Qiqi doesn't really have any sort of buffs that she needs to be building for anyways. All of her buffs are static and dependent on activating her skill, so if you want to ignore all the other parts of her kit and spec entirely into her bursting every rotation and doing a big number, sure, pop off. But her burst doesn't confer any buffs, it's just much harder to justify using, so in general, Tenacity will be Qiqi's set of choice. However, she does have another difference to Beidou and Diona in the fact that she does have pretty significant healing going on. Her burst does significant healing if you use that, her skill does some pretty significant healing of its own, she has a bunch of buffs to healing in her kit and constellations, so she gets access to 2 more artifact sets that have some more significant synergy with healing. Those being Clam and Song of Days Past, which do pretty similar things. Both of them will track the healing that the equipper does and convert them into damage in different ways. Clam creates its own instance of physical damage. This physical damage isn't affected by any sort of other stats you might build, like crit or physical damage bonus, but it is affected by res shred, and given that Stellar Conduct still shreds physical res, you can still get some meaningful damage out of Clam. Clam. It is not optimal, it is much better to run Tenacity and buff the characters that are dealing much more significant damage on your team, but it is a small and silly synergy that if you really just want to be using Ocean Hued Clam on Qiqi, it's not a dysfunctional set. Song of Days Past converts healing into damage by giving your on-fielder a quill effect based on the amount of healing that the equipper does. This is a very small supportive effect, but given that it's going to scale with the stats of your on-fielder, it is a bit better than the damage given by Clam. Tenacity is still better than both of them, especially if in Stellar Conduct teams we get multiple significant damage dealers that all scale off of attack. But if you already have Tenacity on another character, or you just want to be using Clam or Song, they are functional sets that have some light synergy with Qiqi's kit and her teams. They're just never going to be optimal, only usable. And now, final thing that we need to mention is her C6, as the fact that it gives quills based on Qiqi's attack when she casts her burst, it actually does give her some pretty significant build requirements. It makes her want to build enough ER to burst every rotation, and then build only attack from there. This isn't a strong enough effect that it meaningfully changes what artifacts and gear she'll be using. It'll mostly change her weapon options. This isn't a strong enough effect that it'll change what gear you want to put on Qiqi. You won't be doing two-piece attack on her. You'll still want to be running her on more supportive sets that buff the rest of your team more, but it does change her stat priority. It makes her want to build ER, and then after you meet her ER thresholds, it makes you want to spam as much attack as possible. But until you get that C6, she doesn't have really any sort of build requirements, and you can kind of build her however you want. I've chosen to min-max her all into healing, giving her attack healing bonus. You can easily put her on a crit circlet and have her deal a little bit of damage whenever she bursts. If you want to spec more into her burst damage, you can put her on an ER Sands, have her burst every rotation and have that deal a little bit of damage. But after you put her on a supportive artifact set, she's pretty customizable. You could technically spec into her regular cryo damage, you can spec into her burst damage, you can spec all into her healing and then put her on a set that benefits more from healing. Again, not optimal, but a thing you can do. Given that her buffs are all static and her healing is often more than what is necessary, Qiqi is going to get pretty flexible build paths in Stellar Conduct teams. There aren't a massive amount of supportive weapons, so you're going to be able to be a little bit more flexible with these guys' weapons. Of course, there's always Fav. If you haven't met your energy needs, Fav is never a bad option. Both beidou and diona do need their bursts to activate their buffs, and Fav providing an option that gives them a lot of energy while also helping out the rest of your team. Never a bad idea. But if you're meeting your energy needs just fine, then there's no problem in going a more damage-oriented weapon. If you have a Makaira, you could technically go a full EM beidou build. And actually a kind of interesting option that I do want to go over is Forest Regalia. It gives a high base attack, so you still don't have to completely sacrifice damage. It gives energy recharge substats, which is nice. And it has the supportive effect of dropping a leaf when you trigger a Dendro reaction that, when picked up, will give a 120 EM buff at max refines. That's not a bad buff at all, but the one caveat is, of course, it has to be a Dendro reaction that is triggered. Dendro and Cryo don't have a reaction. If you apply them both to an enemy, both auras will exist on them at the same time, which makes it so that Dendro is very easy to introduce into Stellar Conduct teams without many adverse effects. You can use it to squeeze a little bit more electro damage out by getting aggravates. You can use it to activate effects like ones on Forest Regalia. Units like Cyno and beidou still do some significant electro damage, so I'm certainly going to be trying out running some Dendro units in my Stellar Conduct teams to activate weapons like this and get more damage out of them. Definitely not optimal, but it is a fun little path you can go down, and notably right now, that's really only an option on beidou. The craftable bow from Sumeru is just a terrible weapon and doesn't have any supportive utility, but even if it was, like I mentioned, Cryo doesn't have a reaction with Dendro, so even though Sapwood Blade is an identical weapon to Forest Regalia, just in sword form, and therefore it's a good weapon for Qiqi, high base attack so she retains her healing, she could potentially build for a lot of attack with with her C6, she is unable to trigger a dendro reaction as of right now, and therefore unable to access the supportive part of this weapon. We do have some light rumors about Rhymegrass existing in the future. I'm not going to say anything is confirmed. I still think we're a little bit too far out to say anything for certain, but if Rhymegrass does get implemented into the game, this might end up being a pretty decent option on Qiqi. But as of right now, the only real supportive weapon that she gets access to is Fav, but if you don't need the energy, you can do what I'm doing and use a weapon like Finale of the Deep to fully min-max her attack and make her heal as much as possible. In general, it's pretty unnecessary to be min-maxing her attack at all, given that it doesn't really do much of anything until she gets C6. But if you have that C6, then Finale of the Deep isn't a bad option at all. And if you don't have enough energy recharge, you can easily run Amenoma, sacrifices a little bit of the attack that Finale gives to give you some flat energy. Now, let's get on to my favorite character of this upcoming patch. I'm not going to go into absolutely everything because I actually plan to make a video about Mizuki once the patch rolls out. I am absolutely in love with the new direction that they took her kit. I think she's such a more interesting unit, and part of why I'm so interested in her is that these new buffs don't really change her optimal build path all that much. I had a lot of people asking me about Mizuki's optimal build path, so after enough time, I just locked in, did a little bit of calcing, and I found out that at C0, the Animo talent damage that Mizuki gets and the swirl damage that she gets are roughly equal. And I say at C0, but that actually stays pretty true even with constellations. Each one of her constellations buffs both her swirl damage and her talent damage at pretty similar rates. C1 gives you a big swirl, and the buffed version does a little bit of a coordinated attack when that big swirl is triggered. C2 gives some damage bonuses, which these don't affect either of her damages, but it also gives Red Shred to all these elements plus Animo, so the Animo obviously affects her talent damage, and the other elemental Red Shred will affect her swirl damage. Even the same is true of C6. The base effect gives her swirls the ability to crit, and her new C6 additionally gives her regular crit rate and crit damage based on her EM. So, all the way through her constellations, her swirls and her Animo talent damage are performing around similar levels, and therefore she benefits the most from building stats that affect both of her damage types at once, which is EM. Yes, she now has new talent damage that is affected by crit rate and damage bonus, and crit rate and damage bonus will increase her talent damage much more than building more EM, but in turn, she still has some significant swirl damage in her kit, and crit and damage bonus don't affect that swirl damage at all. So even though EM provides a much smaller increase to her talent damage than damage bonus or crit does, the fact that EM also assists her swirl damage makes it so that it keeps up. And I was asked during a live stream if her signature is still actually her best in slot, and for the reasons that I've just mentioned, yes, that is true. I calced it against Nefersig, which gives a bunch of crit value along with a little bit of extra EM, and with Nefersig, her talent damage was only very slightly better, while her swirl damage was significantly worse. This doesn't even count for the fact that her EM is also shared with the rest of her team now. So if you can get good value out of an EM share, it's even more worth it to build EM on her. So right now, I actually have her on an EM crit build, but I've found that now it's still optimal to go full EM on Mizuki. You just need to be searching for crit substats. I think I'm still going to be keeping her on an EM crit build, even though full EM is technically more optimal. I find it's probably going to be more enjoyable to get a little bit of extra Animo damage out of her. That's just how I feel like configuring her. In any case, based on your substats, these two options will be very, very close to each other. And she does definitely want an EM goblet. Although it is worth it to note that she might get Stellar Swirl damage introduced into her kit fairly soon, and if that is the case, if Stellar Swirl damage also scales off of crit like our other special reactions that have been introduced to the game, then obviously a crit circlet will pull ahead. As for sets, those also don't really change. It is true that VV is an incredibly supportive set, and Mizuki's role is still to deal a little bit of damage on field while supporting off-field damage dealers, but even if we ignore the fact that VV shreds res, both of its offensive effects are synergistic with Mizuki. Her two types of damage are Animo damage and swirl damage, and VV buffs both. It's notable to mention that the swirl damage bonus given by VV isn't a 60% multiplier, it's simply adding on more damage bonus to your existing EM multiplier. So right now she gets a 440% damage bonus to swirl. With VV, that goes up to 500%. Her skill buff works in the same way. It gives a damage bonus to swirl based on how much EM she has. This is another additive damage bonus. Given that all she builds right now is EM, the only option she really has is Gilded Dreams, and numerically this set just isn't that good. And given that a lot of her damage is swirl damage and is not animo damage, you still want to be shredding res for other elements on your team, so she still does want VV. But if you have another VV holder on your team and you just want to min-max Mizuki's damage, Gilded Dreams is an option. Night Sky is also actually not the worst thing ever. Assuming you can meet its Ascendant Gleam requirement, it gives some good EM in the 2-piece, and the crit rate isn't too bad. It does force you to spec a little bit more into her animo damage and not her swirl damage, but right now she has very good Ascendant Moongleam teams in Columbina and Anefa. In general, I would just stick to VV. And that's it. A lot of these characters are getting slight changes in how they will be geared because of Stellar Conduct. They are getting significant changes to their base kits, but it doesn't affect their build paths as much. Most of them just need new artifact sets and don't necessarily change their stat priorities. And out of all of them, the one I find to be the most interesting isn't getting a change to her build at all. Let me give a shout out to my channel members: Najodo, Rampaltaz, Mudkip, Beef Potato, Roberto Desu, Big Soup, Buffalo Milk, DB, Soybab, TSI Amat, Smoothie, Tylee, Juicy Jeepers, Nachita Smile, AJ Jordan Draws, Aqua, Starnova, Padevan, Tede Rose, Anime King, and our newest member. Everybody welcome Mr. The Teams. Thank you all so much for your continued support. Keep an eye out for my upcoming Mizuki video once she actually receives her buffs. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something. Have a lovely day.